Now, as someone said, whenever the British face a crisis, they tend to look back to the Second World War as their inspiration. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think on this occasion, it's maybe not a bad analogy. For a start, the Second World War is probably the last time that we faced an economic crisis of this magnitude in terms of the depth and severity of the recession. Also, the Second World War was probably the last time that marketing faced a recession which was partly supply-led, where there were restrictions in supply, there was rationing, for instance, there were blockades, there were problems with imports. And so looking at the Second World War might provide us with a little bit more insight than some of the more recent recessions we've been through. But there's another really important sense in which wartime is a better analogy than a normal recession, and that is that this is a humanitarian crisis first and a recession second. There are lives at stake, and that affects how brands and businesses should behave. In a sense, we all need to be purpose-driven now. Businesses need to think about how they can help the war effort, as it were, how they can help to save lives, how they can help to preserve our way of life, how to make things better for people, how to boost morale. So where they can, if they can afford it, businesses should put principles and purpose first and think about money, profit, recovery second, if they can. The first way that businesses need to do this is through their actions. It's important to do the right things, to do things to help, as I call it, the war effort. And they can. I mean, we've seen some wonderful examples. LVMH, a luxury goods firm, repurposing its factories to produce hand sanitizer. Dyson talking about using its production capabilities to produce ventilators. That's the first thing, is to do the right things. Do the right things by your customers, do the right things by your staff, do the right things by your suppliers, your creditors, all your stakeholders, and to do the right thing for the public at large. Do it because it is the right thing. Do it for moral reasons, for purpose-driven reasons, but also do it because what you do now will be remembered. And firms that don't behave well during the humanitarian crisis may face problems and sanctions later on. They'll have to deal with government, which is playing a more active role in the economy. They'll have to deal with regulators, and they'll have to deal with the public and how they're remembered. So you want to be remembered in the way that Rolls-Royce was remembered during World War II. I'm sure that Rolls-Royce's contribution to the war effort, supplying engines for Spitfires and so forth, helped to affect and forge their brand image and over the post-war period, and also affected how government treated Rolls-Royce as an essential industry in the UK. So do the right things because it is the right thing and because what you do will be remembered. But it's also important to say the right things. And I think that's where marketing communications have an important role to play. While the pandemic's still raging, it's really important that businesses work very hard to make sure that all their marketing is either useful or morale building or both. The distinction that Peter Field and I have made between brand building and sales activation is quite useful here. Sales activation is anything which is designed to provoke an immediate behavioural response. And I've often felt that the best activation is the stuff that people find useful. It gives people the information they need to choose. It helps people to fulfill their shopping missions by making it easy to find the product, to buy the product, and so on. So I think there is a tightly limited role for activation while the pandemic crisis is raging. If you can make sure that your activation is timely, relevant, useful, informative, then people will thank you for it. That might mean, for example, if you're a retailer, telling people about your new opening hours or restrictions on the number of products that people can buy, the new arrangements for social distancing in store, and so on. Giving people useful information, relevant information, as and when they need it, is a form of social good. And the use of things like programmatic to make sure that these messages are tightly tailored to people's needs right now could make this even more useful for people. There is clearly a whole load of other kinds of activation, the sort of hard selling stuff, which is much more focused on pushing people to buy things, is much less relevant at the moment. So rather than thinking of activation as the hard sell, think of it as a kind of customer service, if you like, but you're serving people before the sale rather than after. So, as I say, I think there is a role for tightly focused, useful activation, a more limited role than usual during the pandemic. There may also be a role for brand building. I think people need to be uplifted, they need to be cheered up. These are very dark times. Anything we can do to boost morale will be helpful. And a lot of the best brand advertising and brand communications can actually do that. By brand building, I mean anything which is intended to increase mental availability of your brand and to build positive associations with your brand that will make it more sellable later on. And we know that the best brand building tends to work on an emotional level, and actually likability is a really important dimension of effective brand building. So doing stuff that engages people emotionally and that they love actually is good practice in brand building, and it may also help to raise the mood during the crisis. But there's a really difficult tightrope you have to walk here, because you don't want to do anything that seems to be self-serving. And it doesn't necessarily have to be done through conventional advertising. So earlier on I talked about the importance of doing the right thing, about helping the war effort, about being socially driven, purpose driven. And of course that has a PR dimension to it as well. And that can help to build your brand. So PR is one way of doing things. Sponsorship is another. In a sense, you could almost see the efforts of people like LVMH and Dyson to do stuff to help the war effort as a kind of, branded, sponsored production, if you like. Other ways in which brands may help is, for example, by sponsoring media content, which is entertaining and uplifting and helps people get through lockdown. And in fact, the fact that many media brands are giving content away for free at the moment, it can be seen as a kind of brand building activity, a kind of almost like an internal form of sponsorship. But there is also probably a role for emotional brand building advertising during this pandemic phase, provided that it's not obviously self-serving and exploitative. And that's a very, very tricky balance to pull off.